meeting here now. Sunday evening. Bit of meditation, a little bit of quiet, some stillness. Hopefully you're able to invite that into your day. Tonight I wanted to speak a bit about nonviolence. It's a central quality. And we tend not to think about it very much. In teachings of the Dharma, we focus on certain qualities like loving kindness and compassion, equanimity, sympathetic joy, the paramitas, giving and patience and energy and sila, virtue, meditation and wisdom. Those are the paramitas. And those are all the qualities of the Eightfold Path we try to cultivate. The nonviolence, Ahiṃsā, which is the Sanskrit term, it is very central to some of the great heroes of the past who made great changes. So when sometimes the Dharma is considered by some to be somewhat passive, just letting the birds finish. Finish. There they are again. Practicing patience. Oh, there. You wait long enough, everything passes. So, one time there was a general during the Buddha's time who challenged the Buddha and said to him that his approach is passive. It's world denying, which is still something that we hear today. People who get a first exposure to Buddhism and meditation, one of the reactions to meditation is often, waste of time. Do something. And and the Buddha responded to the general that he preaches or he advocates passivity or inactivity in relation to unwholesome deeds or harmful deeds. And activity in relation to good deeds and thoughts and speech. And then he finished by saying, and what can constitutes or what makes up, good actions is left up to your discernment, he said to the general. It's left up for you to decide. So we see that when we talk about the Dharma, it's actually a proactive approach to avoiding harm and contributing to the good. So it's true if anyone opposes and says, seems like meditation is very passive. You should agree. It is. It's very passive in relation to harmful thoughts and harmful states of mind and anger and greed and delusion and aversion. Very passive to those, meaning leaving them alone and do not pursue them. So in that regard, yes, when we observe those states of mind in meditation and in our consciousness outside of meditation, in the mindfulness we want to continue with us, our approach should be inactive. I mean, don't get involved with those. Let them fade and pass. Don't feed them anything. Don't feed them anything. Because whatever energy you give to will become stronger. So you give more energy to the positive qualities and they will strengthen. You don't feed the negative ones, they won't. So it's true, it is a passive approach, but to certain things. But because we are, this week is in this country is taking time to consider the military history here in Remembrance Day and the trials and the losses that are involved when it comes to armed struggle and war, then it gives us opportunity to pause and to consider how do we live as practitioners and people pursuing an enlightened life and trying to cultivate wisdom. How do we live in a society, and not just Israel, but in many societies, most societies, where the military is still a very strong part and a military mentality is still a very central part of the identity and the approach in almost every country. There's a strong belief in the necessity of having armies and at times the necessity of war. How do we come to terms with that? And, with the probability that that's not going away anytime soon. It's really not, And even the Buddha recognized that. And there's an interesting exchange in the sutras where the Buddha and an old friend of his named King Pesanati, and they were both 80 years old when this exchange was recorded. So you have this old Buddha and an old king, and 80 back then is old. So today it's sort of middle-aged, but back then 80 was ancient. And you have this old king, which was pretty much the other way the Buddha could have gone. So he was talking to sort of his alter ego, in a sense, King Pasenadi, who had conquered many lands and had a very big kingdom and a strong army. The king praises the Buddha and the teachings and the conduct of his followers. And he describes himself as a warrior king to the Buddha. And he describes what it means as a king. And one of the descriptions was, and to have executed who was, who needed to be executed. And after the king departs, the Buddha comments to all of the Sangha around him who is listening to this exchange and the teaching. That the king's thoughts were monuments to the Dharma, he said. He called them monuments to the Dharma, and that they should be learned and remembered as fundamentals of the holy life. So the Buddha praises the king as a sort of righteous king. The king who had led wars, who had ordered executions. So a king who had been very active in the military life. It brings up the questions of what nonviolence means, because the Buddha clearly does teach, and this is in Dhammapada, where he said, all tremble at violence. All fear death. Putting oneself in the place of another, one should not kill or cause another to kill. So with that statement, how do we square that with the Buddha's praise of the warrior king, who at the end of his life had led many campaigns which probably caused the deaths of thousands of people? So these are conflicts that are hard to reconcile. But what it does suggest is that the Buddha's ideal of nonviolence does not always mean lack of armed conflict. The nonviolence must mean something bigger or something else. And this is important for us to understand, so that he isn't just, being accused of passively accepting bad situations, the harm of others. Even we fast forward to someone like the Dalai Lama, and when he comments on this exchange, he said, nonviolence does not mean we have to passively accept injustice. We have to fight for our rights. We have to oppose injustice. And Gandhi fervently promoted nonviolence. But that didn't mean he complacently accepting of the status quo. He resisted, but without causing harm. He continued to say, I consider nonviolence to be compassion in action. It doesn't mean weakness or simply doing nothing. It is to act without violence, motivated by compassion, recognizing the rights of others. So when we understand nonviolence in sort of a way in this direction, as compassion in action, we can start to understand that we are talking about action here. We are talking about fighting for a change to make the world a better place, to cease harm and to increase the good. But this has to do then with what's called volition or intention. You know, what is the intention here? What is the right intention? Can you be involved in conflict? And this is one of the most delicate things. Can you be involved in conflict without anger? This is a fine line that is hard to really comprehend unless it's coming from a place of deep practice and wisdom. And then it becomes compassion in action. Can we have forceful action that is not based on the desire to harm, but rather the desire to protect and help? And can we do that with full honesty and clarity and purity of mind? From that place, can you fight? From that place. And if not, if there is the desire to cause harm or even to kill, then you are betraying the precepts. The nonviolence is connected to right action. And right action means it's pretty clearly stated. It means not killing and not stealing and not having any harmful sexuality. It's the area of virtue in the Eightfold Path. There's also the precepts of not speaking lies or untruths and not taking intoxicants. But right action is defined more exclusively as just those three of not killing, stealing, or having harmful sexuality. Because intoxicants and speech, or speaking truthfully, are included in the other parts of the Eightfold Path of, right speech is one of them. And right mindfulness is covering, not having an intoxicated mind, because you can't really be mindful if you're intoxicated. So right action is the aspect of not killing, stealing, or having harmful sexuality. But how do we know that it's right? Right means wholesome and not unwholesome. Right means not causing harm and helping. So we have to be clear that it really has to do with the area of volition and karma, and that's what makes something right. That's what makes something right. So that if you're walking along the street, and the simplest example of this is that it did happen, and it does happen to me almost after the rain every day. I step on a snail, and I hear a crunch. It's unpleasant, and I feel bad about it. And it was completely unintentional. In that case, the karma of killing is not received. If I see a snail and I go for it, the karma of killing is received. So to not kill, when I'm looking at right action, the first aspect of not killing is not wanting to kill. It's not just that I happen to not to kill. If I'm in a war and I want to kill, and I don't happen to shoot anybody because my aim is bad, I'm still cultivating a karma of killing, because the volition, the desire to kill, is there. And that desire to kill comes out of fear and anger. So when we want to practice nonviolence, and we want to practice right action, the first thing we got to do is to look within and practice the meditative awareness of recognizing the roots of violence. What are those roots? Those roots of violence. Okay, they're in the poisons of aversion, of attachment and delusion. You know, those fires and delusions that cloud our mind. You know, aversion, anger. You know, hatred, anger, and aversion. That whole aspect of like not wanting something. What that does is that creates an inner violence. And that inner violence then cultivates into something that is expressed then in from thought to speech into action. You know, it's on its way out. And that's the nature of fire. That's why they're called the three fires, is because it not only does it burn you and your mind, but it spreads and eventually becomes an outer action. So practicing right action necessitates that we practice right meditation, right mindfulness. You want to look within and see, okay, you know, if I want to really practice nonviolence, it doesn't mean just suppressing the urge for violence. It means closely noticing, you know, when those triggers arise and you start to feel that discomfort, that dis-ease, the dukkha, which is dis-ease. You know, I've lost my peace of mind because I'm unsettled, I'm upset. I'm upset at what? You know, something has triggered that reaction, which is experienced in anger or fear. You have to notice it in your mind, even in a subtle way. Because otherwise what happens is that it starts to cultivate and create a karma, meaning create a conditioning. Karma is simply the mental conditioning that we are repeating over and over again until it becomes so habitual, we don't even notice it arising. We just have a state of anger always there under the surface, bubbling. And that's going to explode into violence. The root of violence is the anger and fear that you experience in small ways in your mind. And if you don't take care of that, and I mean care for it by observing it and breathing with it and accepting it and then releasing it, if you don't care for it, it will explode into violence. So when we talk about Ahiṃsā, non-violence, it's the approach of inner awareness, of finding those deep roots that we've been reinforcing for much of our lives in an unchosen way, a choiceless way. You're not choosing to be angry, nobody would, because it's an affliction and it's painful. You know, if I could give you a choice, would you like right now to feel like strong anger or strong compassion? Which one do you choose? It's pretty obvious, right? If you could like have a conscious choice, you would say, I want the compassion, loving kindness, and sympathetic joy. Like that's just that'll feel better. But we're afflicted by anger because we're not necessarily choosing it. We aren't choosing it. But we can choose to be aware of it. This is where we start to turn things around. Where we turn anger into wisdom and mindfulness release is when we place our attention on that process so that we expect it. You know, I expect it. There's anger again, right? It's a form of violence. If you can call it for what it is, it's self-violence, right? I mean, we oppose violence in the world, right? But we tend to feel like our anger, we kind of accept like it's here, it happens, you know. But it's really unstabilizing, destabilizing, and causing harm to your mind. And if you can recognize that and accept that your anger and fear and aversion and attachments, those fires are actually forms of violence. afflicting your own mind. You might take it a little more seriously that this is something a fire I need to put out. Because the more it burns, the more it creates scars or karmic patterns that make the fire harder to put out and more likely to continue. And where does it continue? It continues outwards into the world, into actual violence. There was a story I read about a Tibetan monk named Palden Gyatso. And Palden Gyatso, he became famous for a bad reason. He was in a Chinese jail for 33 years and tortured almost daily in a really terrible way. And finally, due to international pressure and Amnesty International and different governments pressuring, because this monk who was imprisoned for having some teachings of the Dalai Lama and photos, had been in prison for 33 years. It was finally released, and he made his way. He then was he traveled to Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama was, and had an audience with him. And this guy was the account of torture he gives is really harrowing. And the Dalai Lama asked him, he said, what were you, what was your biggest fear? Were you afraid you were going to die? He said his biggest fear was that he'd stop seeing the Chinese as his brothers. That was his biggest fear. That he'd give in to anger. And in another interview he had, the interviewer asked him, how did you never feel hatred or anger during this time? And when he understood the question, he shook his head. He said, no. No, he said, of course, when I was being tortured, anger and hatred would arise. Like, of course that would happen. But I kept remembering the teachings, which would say, do not respond to anger with anger. And I was able to release it. And the teachings became a lifeboat for him. Without teachings of, enlightened ones, and this guidance, when we will be put into that position, which, hopefully we never will, but we will be put in other positions that will test us. You will be tested according to your ability. And if you don't have a lifeboat, your mind will sink. It'll sink into the hatred and anger that you're being hit with. So his lifeboat, his raft, the raft that carried him across, were the teachings of, don't respond to hatred with hatred. This is an eternal law. Don't respond to anger with anger. This is an eternal law, only with love. Those teachings are well known, but we need to be able to recall them at the right moment. When you need them, they will be a lifeboat for you. And this is why we need to, yes, do meditation, but reflect on the teachings frequently, because otherwise you may not, find that boat when you need it most. We all will need it. And we're tested generally on a daily basis. You may not be aware of the test. And maybe you passed it by chance. But the test of your ability to not respond in kind when you're faced with anger and attachment or aggression and violence or even hatred, to not respond in the same way, to not mirror it, but rather to, respond with its opposite, with the antidote to that poison. Mm. These examples exist, and they really are remarkable. The teachings and the heroes exist, and we should take their example. One of the great examples, of course, is Martin Luther King Jr. And he has a quote that I found so inspiring. I wanted to share with you. He and Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, these are the great, figures of nonviolence in the past century. And the Dalai Lama, of course. And Martin Luther King Jr., in one of his speeches, he said this. He said, at the center of nonviolence is the principle of love. Here is the true meaning and the value of compassion and nonviolence. But it helps us see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, and to know his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weaknesses of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition. And further, he said, nonviolence means avoiding not only the external physical violence of spirit. You not only refuse to shoot a man, you refuse to hate him. But how do we refuse to hate him? Well, that's what he explained in the sentences before, which was, but if you're mature enough, you'll see that maybe he has a point. Maybe underneath that hatred, it doesn't mean he's right in the hatred or in the anger or in the distorted accusations, but perhaps there's some wisdom. There's some wisdom in this sentient being as well. Perhaps it will teach me something about love. What does it teach me? What is the other side? What is their point of view? What are their greatest wishes, hopes, and dreams? And when I consider that, my anger tends to evaporate because I see them as an equal human being, an equal seeker of happiness and peace, clouded and lost in the smoke and fire of anger and attachment and delusion. And the real delusion here is that because we're so separate, it's a win-lose situation. Like, it's either you get what you want and I don't, or I get what I want and you don't. That's the delusion of separation. When we see past that separation and we see that we're in this together, then it's only a win-win situation. This time of a virus that is quite a global situation gives a little hint of that, but I don't know if it's going to change people's perspectives as much as necessary of how interdependent we are and how if we don't work together, we're going to suffer together. Hopefully we'll learn some lessons that will be of benefit to that cooperation, that sense of unity. But we can just speak for ourselves and hope to take those lessons to heart. But when Martin Luther King Jr. talks about the internal violence that we want to avoid the most, the violence of spirit, that's the real hatred that we need to avoid. The violence of spirit, because that's what develops and cultivates into violence of, body. So when we want to practice nonviolence and right action, so that we avoid killing and stealing and harming others in whatever way, we have to first explore the roots of violence. And the roots of violence are in the way we relate to the world through anger and fear and attachment, through greed and self-centeredness. And that's not to blame, that's to be aware. And in awareness, there is clarity. The clarity that those states of mind cause violence to myself, and that violence causes suffering. So instead of it being guilt, there's compassion. To see violence is to arouse compassion. And that's why the Dalai Lama said that nonviolence is compassion in action. Because nonviolence requires us to observe the violence. And when we observe violence, we awaken compassion. Because if we first start with ourselves, we become aware immediately that those states of mind which are violent cause suffering. And so we wish not to suffer. And that wish not to suffer is the definition of compassion. And just as we wish that, so do others. So how does that bring us to our society? Society is a composition of many people living together. We all have hopes and dreams and suffer. We all have great love, but also great fear. We have a karmic history of a lot of violence and a lot of fear and anger. All of us together. And then we bring it all together and it becomes a culture. The only way we can change that is by working on ourselves and changing ourselves. And together we can cultivate something that is more helpful. So, before I ask for questions, I will read a few verses from the Dhammapada on the in the chapter called Anger. The Buddha's words on anger, which I think are relevant, because as we see anger as a source of violence, and if we want to practice nonviolence, we need to practice non-anger. Relinquish anger. Let go of conceit. Release yourself from all that binds you. The pure-hearted, who cling neither to body nor mind, do not suffer. Transform anger with kindness, and evil with good, meanness with generosity, and deceit with integrity. These three ways lead to heaven. Speaking the truth, not giving in to anger, and giving even if you have only a little to share. The awakened ones do not cause harm. All pollution is cleared from the minds of those who are always vigilant, training themselves day and night, and whose lives are fully intent upon liberation. What we can appreciate here is that this type of practice that we're engaged in is continuous training of the mind, not about suppressing something or, judging it as bad when anger arises, but basically not giving into it. And that's what he said, abstaining from it, saying, I have a choice and I'm not going down that road. I'm not going to indulge this emotion. And we indulge the emotion by getting involved with the story. So in mindfulness, we want to not indulge the stories by going over them in our mind. Why did she do this? Why did he do this? Why is this happening to me? The why is not a question we need to ask while we're being, observant and vigilant. The what is what we ask. So in mindfulness, we're being very vigilant to keep a mindful eye on what is happening now and what is occurring so that it won't catch me unaware. Suddenly I'm angry. How did that happen? Where did that come from? You weren't looking. You weren't looking. So the vigilance here means I need to really, this training is, is nonstop. But it's for liberation. It seems too much until you consider why you're doing it. You're doing it to be fully released from negative states of mind. What else do you want to be doing? Isn't that really like what you want to do with your mind? To be fully immersed in positive states and having fully relinquished the negative ones? So, the good news is there's no break from that. Like there's no break. Your mind's all, going to be one way or the other. And we want to just kind of encourage it to be in the good way and discourage it from the negative ways, which just reinforce that negative karma. So choose the good, moment by moment. That's the nonviolence, and that's where it's not passive, actually. It's incredibly active. And it's the vigilance of saying, oh, I notice there's anger here. I notice there's aggression. I notice there's fear. I notice there's, guilt or betrayal, or I notice there's judgment. And what that does to my mind is it makes it self-centered. But love and compassion are other-centered. Just when you even say the words, greed and envy and anger, it's narrow. It's self-focused. And compassion and kindness are open. So you just want to notice that state of mind even. Is my mind closing or is it opening? Am I being more attentive and aware and observing? Or am I being kind of, withdrawn? It doesn't mean being extroverted. It just means, you are curious and interested in your mind. Mm. Interestingly enough, in the history of, of Zen, in fact, it began with Zen with around the year 500. There was the great monastery called Shaolin, and it was Bodhidharma, the first ancestor of Zen, who began that monastery, the Shaolin monks. And they exist until today, a 1500-year tradition of what? Of Kung Fu. The Shaolin monks from the year 500, Bodhidharma came and he saw that everybody was just sitting on their behinds. And he said, you need to do something with your body. And he trained them to, do these military and these self-defense moves. They were, throughout the ages, these Shaolin monks who were warrior monks, they were used for different things, not always for the Dharma, and that's for sure. And there's been much corruption throughout the ages, definitely in every, Buddhist society of using its military for conquest. Mm-hmm. But the tradition of the warrior monk, which later in Japan became something called Bushido. Bushido is the way of the samurai, which was the way of the sword, coming out from the Shaolin monks. Continuing that development of wanting to take the energy of anger and transform it into, physical activity, as a ritual and as a practice of awareness, not to be used against others, but as a way of self-mastery. So it's the opposite of wanting to repress or suppress or to deny that the anger and the hatred and the strong energy, those strong energies, that they existed. No, I'm saying I'm very clear they exist. And I'm not going to use them, in a harmful way. But I'm going to use them. I'm going to use them. So that's the big question each person has to ask themselves: is what do you do with that energy? And if you deny it, then it will become stronger. But if you can transform it into wisdom and into whatever practice you use in order to, I think a lot of body practices are very helpful in that way, to help transform that, the negative mental energy into positive physical energy. And that's what that tradition of the Shaolin monks and the Bushido way of the sword, what they're about, is taking that and transforming anger into precision and movement, which imitated war without causing harm. I'm not suggesting that specific, tradition for us, because we're not part of that. But I think it's incumbent upon everybody to be aware of those forceful energies within us that sometimes want to become externalized. And so we should externalize them in a transformed and wise way. Go for a run. That's why in Zen there was a strong tradition of work. And work is a way of taking your physical energy, putting it to good use. Chopping firewood and drawing water. That was the famous saying of Layman Pang. This is my enlightened practice, is chopping wood and carrying water. So as you come to these days where it's very fixated upon the sense of loss and a sense of gain, soldiers having died and land having been won, and the cycle of violence just continuing over and over throughout the years, and with no end in sight, then the approach we should have is that vigilant awareness of the roots of violence within ourselves, and then to transform that into action, which is compassion, as the Dalai Lama said. That if you really want to practice nonviolence, then it's compassion in action, which is looking around at the world that is still very much repeating these patterns. And responding with compassion and care. So we first cultivate it in our own minds, and then we create that as a way of relating and a new pattern with which we relate to the world outside of us. And then however it becomes active, that will naturally be expressed. So before we sit for another minute to finish, would someone like to say something? You can unmute yourself.
Daniel, I have a question. I wanted to ask what would be the approach of the Buddhism, of the Zen towards violence of the other, the enemy. Like how do you, when it's clear violence, brutal violence, how do you cope with that?
Mm-hmm.
How can you find compassion for that?
Well, we should understand what compassion is. Compassion is the heartfelt wish that suffering will end in oneself and in others. And violence is a form of suffering that is inflicted upon others and in oneself, in the person who caused the violence. So if we can look at violence and the main understanding we have is of the suffering that's caused there, then recognizing suffering is the main way to arouse compassion. Does compassion mean you're not responsible anymore? That, you just did it because you're suffering too? No. Compassion means you fully see the pain of this situation and you want it to be ended. And maybe the wise response to end the suffering would be to go in with an army. I mean, I don't know. Maybe if that can be done without anger and with only the desire to end suffering as quickly as possible, maybe that would be the appropriate response. The Buddha did not teach for armies to be disbanded. He didn't tell the king Pasadena that like you should disband your army. That wasn't his. He gave no political advice to anybody. Like that, he just was non-political. And believe me, there was a lot of bad stuff going on around that time. So what he is teaching is that when you choose to act, it should be from a place of recognizing suffering and motivated through the desire to end suffering. And if you can be clear of those intentions, then the course of action you decide upon will be the right one. But if your actions are predicated upon, anger and fear, then probably it's going to continue the cycle of violence because you're just getting back. So yeah, as a practitioner, the first thing we want to do is to pause and deeply contemplate on the suffering that is, not only resulted from the violence, but is the cause of the violence and, the mind of the violence. So we want to see the suffering all around, right? I mean, as Martin Luther King Jr. was saying, you have to consider his point of view. Not that he's right in choosing violence. No way. That's not the point of view he's talking about considering. He's talking about considering the pain and the suffering of that person as well, which does not justify. This is the point of compassion. Compassion doesn't justify, a bad action. Compassion is simply recognizing the reality of pain that is causing people in every situation to do the wrong thing. Wisdom and compassion are mutually inclusive. When you look around with the perspective and the eyes of compassion, then you have a clear understanding, a more wise understanding of what's going on and how I should respond. But if you don't see the compassion, but rather through the reaction, the kind of conditioned response of anger and fear, then, we're going to keep the fire burning. The fire is going to keep burning. So yeah, so there could be a terrible thing. I mean, somebody could be a suicide bomber and you could have children blown up on a bus, or you could have people like, doing domestic violence and, raping their children. I mean, of course, the worst things you could even imagine. Am I like excusing them because they're in pain? No, not at all. Maybe they should go to jail. Maybe probably. But am I going to first, for the sake of my own mind, deeply, deeply contemplate and consider the terrible pain that is being caused and causing. And then I think my responses and the actions I choose will be more effective. So yeah, before anything happens, I have to consider the deep suffering that is making the world go round and around the way it is. When your mind is free of anger, the action you choose will most probably be the right one. When your mind is clouded with some fear and anger, the action will probably, perpetuate that fear and anger and make it spread. So yes, maybe there is something called an ethical army. Maybe there is. But that army would have to be free of anger. And that would be a hard thing to achieve. Anyone else want to? So let us finish with a minute to dedicate this evening. May our practice be strong and free of all defilements. May our minds be open and caring. May our hearts be full of compassion and loving kindness. May our practice in our lives be a benefit to all others, so that suffering may end and happiness may flourish.